academics tend to frighten me, Paul.
Oh.
And you've progressed into the academic world and become a teacher. But I'd like to go back to the very beginnings, really. An engineer. So what was the interest in engineering?
Well, wanting to be an artist, really. It's the nature of growing up, I suppose, in the Rhondda, and having had an experience from the age of 7 or 8 of photography. My uncle was a very keen amateur photographer, member of Barry Camera Club, darkroom and everything. So I spent a lot of time with him learning about photography, understanding how all that works. So I went to school, I'm still going to school before I was doing that actually. But, I was going through school and I really liked the idea of being visually creative, and I was very interested in buildings. And I like buildings. I used to photograph buildings as a kid, really. And at school, it became a choice between back then in the what would that be, in the 1960s, in Ferndale Grammar School, Girls' School. Well, you either do if you want to be an architect, it's a combination of science and art. You've got to decide whether you want to do art or science in school, because we don't do anything as sophisticated as mix those things together. Well, it's still a bit of a battle, actually, I think, today. But so I went down the science route, did chemistry and physics and so on, and at the same time then evolved a little bit into doing art. But I was useless at school. It was terrible. I ended up with, I think I had one O-level. So my mother said, you better get a job. And good job for life is to be an apprentice engineer or something, do an apprenticeship. And one came up at Corona Soft Drinks in what is now the Pop Factory in Porth, which then was still the Pop Factory. They weren't producing pop, but it was the storeroom for all the stuff. So I was lucky I had an apprenticeship as a fabricator welder. And I thought, well, okay, this is what I got to do, and then I'm going to do it. Deeply frustrated, so I'm still kind of taking pictures, and I'm still actually doing things like drawing and so on, But work actually became so busy, I was doing 7 days a week and everything else. And because I realised actually, as soon as I left school, I was academically quite capable, but school just didn't make it work. And I think it's like that for a lot of people. I very quickly progressed. And in fact, we are sitting today in the Butte building here, and I came here to do a degree in engineering in the days when it was the University of Wales Institute for Science and Technology. Oh, yeah. So there you go. But I didn't finish it, but that was it, and that got me into the engineering very quickly, or not quickly, 5 years of an apprenticeship, but. Again, I really wanted to do photography, so I decided to work as an assistant.
What sort of photographs were you taking during that time when you were an apprentice?
I would say it was a bit of everything. It's like one of those things where you're just interested in photography, not really sure what it was. I can remember. In fact, I still have some of the pictures. Of getting a Polaroid camera, actually, which was a bit of a novelty, and in fact, it's probably the first time I ever photographed a house, an end of a house in the Valley Street. Right. It was my auntie's house, and my auntie and my uncle are outside it, with a terrace above and so on. So, in a way, you can see little things, but which probably led to what I would eventually do. But it was a bit of a mixed bag.
But it would have been a big jump to go from presumably a quite secure job as a fabricator welder into doing photography. How was did you feel it was a big leap, or was it?
No, it was very gradual, you see, because one of the things I'm very good at, I think, is being critical of how things are being done, and so in engineering, for example, I was always trying to organise things. You know, this workshop's not running properly. You know, look at the mess on that, and so the downside of that is that all of a sudden somebody puts you in charge. And then it's different because actually, it becomes my responsibility. So actually, I became a manager in some ways quite quickly as well. I don't know, probably in my mid-20s. So the engineering work was always interesting. I was always still, in the spare time that I had, working with a professional photographer, as an assistant, but then I used to sort of do jobs on my own. I used to start to do, as you would expect, architectural work, but I was getting paid for it, you know, and we were doing a lot of social photography, as you know, weddings and portraits and so on, product photography. So we were, you know, there was lots, not so much now, but there used to be a lot of furniture manufacturers, so it would be photographing three-piece suites and, you know, all sorts of things like that, you know. So that was going on. And of course, as you can imagine, you know, I was also, in engineering, I was kind of looking after a workshop, but I was also, in a way, the person that went out with clients. You know, I'd be sort of looking at work, measuring work, designing things, costing them up and so on. And I'd always be talking about photography, you know, and they'd say, oh, actually, we want some pictures of whatever. So I actually did quite a bit of industrial photography, you know, which was slightly different. So in some ways, I learned a lot about photography obviously from my uncle and so on, and those sort of formative days of just learning techniques and so on. Then I learned a lot about commercial photography, being a professional photographer, because and it was good, I think, because I came from this, you know, this twin life, this engineering thing, because it was always about, well, it's a client, somebody's paying you to do something, you have to do it right, you have to do it on time, you have to be polite, you have to have the person skills and so on and so forth. So, you know, that was quite good, quite a good balance. But then I think that's, you know, again, like lots of other people, never quite satisfied. And I thought, well, actually, perhaps I should now try and learn about photography. And in some ways, that might have been, I'm still not quite sure whether that was a good thing or not. But decided to go to do an A-level. And actually, that's where I met Tim Collier.
Ah. A great friend of Ffoton's.
Yes, indeed. And Tim and I we hit it off and very friendly. And Tim opened my eyes really to quite a few things about photography, but one of them was the American photographer Walker Evans. And I realised that all of a sudden that something which I'd kind of been feeling for a while was that, you know, just the things around you, the everyday things in your world. You don't have to go to Barbados or anywhere else to make pictures. Actually, there's a really interesting thing to do just where you live. So sort of quite quickly then, I think I finished that. And then that's when I started to make some projects around where I lived. And I decided that I would not go further than 5 miles from the house, sort of thing, you know. Yeah. So that was that. Of course, then the more that you study, I think. Well, I thought, well, okay, well, I did an A-level. I was quite good at that, you know. Perhaps I should do. You know, I was interested to learn, absolutely. And at that time, there were opportunities to study at Newport part time, and our friends Pete Davis was working there, and Ron McCormick was there at the time, and Clive Landon. And Daniel Meadows was just leaving, but that's another story which we better not mention in this building because the building might shake. And I had actually two fantastic bosses who the company I was working for. I said, look, you've probably worked out by now. I mean, I love photography. I've got a chance to go and, I've been accepted to study photography. It's a part-time course, 5 years, 1 day a week. How do you feel about me taking my leave 1 day a week? And, there'll be a few days where perhaps I might need unpaid leave. And they didn't hesitate. They said, off you go, do it. Tremendous.
Enlightened.
I was kind of, I was quite important to the organisation as well, but they were brilliant. And then that was that. And then I started that, and that's really when I started the crossover to the more academic world, I suppose, because once I'd done that, then I started to work in engineering in different ways. I became more sort of a consultant type contractor kind of work. So basically I was reducing the amount of engineering time and then increasing the amount of time I was working on photography. Some of it was commercial, a lot of it was working as in a sort of artist residency type work, working with communities and so on, which was great. That's how I know Vauxhall very well, and the valleys. I was doing a lot of work in the Rhymney Valley. And then one day I kind of realised, actually I'm working in photography now. So that crossover, it was gradual, and I was just lucky that the circumstances worked for me. And again, I would say to anybody, if you're doing one thing but you're really passionate about the other, don't give up. There are ways across. And sometimes some people prefer to do that quite quickly, and other times less.
And what made you give up the commercial aspect of photography and being a professional photographer?
I think I realised that I wanted to continue developing my own knowledge about photography, as in the history of photography and the sort of more of the cultural dimension of photography. And I had started to do some teaching with night classes. I think I started to teach them. I taught A-level actually for Tim Collier actually for a short while, for about a year. But then I realised that I could actually teaching something, you have to learn it really well because you can't tell people rubbish. So I found that the teaching part of that was really useful. It helped me to learn, and hopefully, I was helping other people to learn. And I think because of my life journey to that point, I think I brought something to it which perhaps somebody who'd been purely, a photographic academic forever, they have a place obviously, but I mean I think I brought something different, so I was hoping I was bringing something else. But of course I fell into my trap of being completely dissatisfied with what I saw around me, and I said, well look, if you're going to run a course, let's run it like this, and and then the next thing, before I knew it, I found myself really not teaching that much and becoming a kind of an academic manager,
which you had the knowledge of because you'd managed in a commercial business. Your interest in the history of Welsh photography is and your knowledge of the history of Welsh photography is phenomenal. I think Brian and I we came to one of your lectures in the museum, and it's a fascinating subject. Now, and its origins, I think, are wonderful in many respects, but they were photographers from a different class. Maybe they weren't working class photographers as such, because they were quite well off. What people stand out in that early time of Welsh photography for you?
Well, yeah, thank you for saying some kind of things there, but I think if I can just say that I've in more recent years, realised that there's a big project for all of us to work on, which is which I call photography in Wales.
Yeah.
Right. There's two things. I mean, photography on its own is okay. It's kind of interesting, but when you put it with something, it is really interesting. So. And particularly Wales, because it's an amazingly interesting place, culturally, socially, and so on. So if you sort of start to think of it, just frame it as photography in Wales, you think about the beginnings of photography, which you're right, it was kind of, you had to have privilege, you had to have the time and the money to be able to develop that. And as we know, our friends in Swansea, the Dilwyns and the Dylan Llewellyn and Calvert Jones and so on, they were part of a owner, owners of major sort of money-making operations. I think you've got to look there, and Fox Talbot, who we often talk about, he as a child he went to Penrice Castle on the Gower, and and then the world was very different. The gentlemen were polymaths. I said gentlemen, not the ladies, and the ladies were as well, of course, but that's hidden away a little bit. But and so they were interested in everything. So Fox Talbot was an Egyptologist and a scientist and so he kind of came to Wales, and it's his cousin, the Rice Talbots in Margam, and so that's kind of where it all starts, and interesting. And again, I think it's one of the things that sort of got me interested in the history of photography in Wales, if you like, is that then if you look at their photographs, they could photograph in their places of work, where they manufacture ceramics or whatever it is that is being made. They don't do it because it wasn't the done thing, and that's okay, that's fine. And in fact, I think the first of the great sort of industrialists to actually really turn the camera on their own thing was Crochet in Merthyr, and even then he was sort of photographing at a distance. It's not
selective.
It's people's life. So it is interesting. I think those early photographers. Now, to answer your question, I think probably the most interesting photographer of the Victorian period was probably Robert Thompson. Is that right? Or Robert Thomas? Oh, I should know, shouldn't I? Who actually was based in Liverpool, but he used to do tours every year through Wales, and he was a jobbing photographer. So he'd work his way around, stay in a town for a couple of days, make portraits, process them, sell them, and he'd follow the markets so that lots of people turn up for the agriculture.
So there would be postcards, basically.
Yeah, postcards, but also selling prints, and sometimes if there's a couple of beautiful pictures that he did actually of prize sheep, so there'd be a beautiful portrait of a sheep, tremendous. But he was making money out of that, and it's kind of interesting because he also, I think, shows how different Wales was in the Victorian times, not because of the way that people looked, which in itself is interesting, but he did concentrate a lot on the harbours around Wales, because of course the growing industries. He didn't do so much work in southeast Wales actually, but certainly southwest Wales and the rest of it, and goods were being moved, so the slate and so on from North Wales, that it was shipped. I mean, that's how it worked, and he did also, which I think was great, he actually started to photograph the ingress of railways into Wales, and particularly in North Wales, going across, of course, to Holyhead, and then because the railways were opening up and so on and so forth. So I think that he's fascinating to look at, and I mean his work is in the National Library of Wales, and I think there are several publications about his work, but again, and the great thing now, I think, for anybody who's interested in that period, you can go online. I mean, just go onto the National Library of Wales website, and you can find, you've got to work a little bit to get at it, but you can find it, and it's fascinating. But back to this thing about history, you see, what's interesting, I think, is that there are lots of pockets of information, and the National Library have done some work, obviously, around their collection there, but we are yet to kind of pull all this together in some way. And you can't do it all. You can never, it's impossible to do it all. But I think, that's what I've been interested in doing, is trying to sort of say, oh, look at that, that's interesting. Oh, look at that, that's interesting. And sometimes you do need to dive in and get at some of the real detail. But we could do with a few people just coming in and helping to kind of pull the whole thing together.
So what do you envisage then? What do in your if you had all the money in the world in order to do it, what would you envisage?
Okay. I could see lots of sports cars outside. No, no, actually, absolutely not. No, I think what I would like to see is it's not a repository, a network, and this is not about sort of necessarily having all the materials and all the objects in one place, because you can't do that, because that's impossible. But it's almost about creating some sort of hub, which would become the first port of contact, first port of call for somebody interested in photography in Wales, so it signposts to these wonderful places. And you look around Wales, and actually there are some amazing collections, because the National Library's probably got the biggest collection, I think, over 1 million photographs. The National Museum itself, amazing photography in there. Over 500,000 photographs, 200,000 of those just focus on industry. Gracious. But Welsh life as well, and so on. And that's spread across the 7 sites. You've got Swansea Museum as some of the earliest photography. You have Aberystwyth School of Art has a very good photography collection there. And so on and so on. And actually, and Newport Art Gallery Museum, they have some interesting photography relating to Newport. So there are lots of really good collections, and there's been work done locally, if you like, to kind of talk about what's in the collections. And I would really like to see somewhere where, if you wanted to know a little bit about the life of rural Wales, chapels, whatever, you could almost sort of do a kind of a search, and it would say, well, actually, in the National Library there's that, in the museum there's that, so it's just about indicating ways to go. I think, particularly in terms of the way the technologies have developed now, the idea of there being a sort of national centre for photography, if we want to call it that, I think that's kind of slightly gone. Gone,
yes. We're talking really in terms of creating a hub, which is basically a web-based depository where stuff can be brought in if necessary to show, and where links can be created to specific areas of the National Library, where you can specifically look at one artist's work rather than having to go there. Fascinating stuff. Brian's brought up an interesting point about whether we need some sort of foundation a la Martin Parr Foundation, which has been set up in Bristol, but that has a lot of money behind it, really. I mean, money drives everything these days. And maybe I'll bring up the point, should these ideas flow through an institution we have already, which is Photo Gallery?
Yeah, okay. Martin Parr is, as we all know, a genius, and incredibly generous, and is underwriting his foundation himself, which is amazing. if you like, there's a limitation to that, though, in that he, quite rightly, is heavily focused on British documentary photography. So the way I always characterise this is that, going back to the museum, National Museum, of all those photographs, there's so many, really amazing photographs across numerous collections. Okay, now the museum, as certainly in the last decade, has been engaging. It's always engaged with photography, but I think it's been looking at what it's got in its collections, and there was some EMYR funding about 5-6 years ago for a project called Natural Images, which is actually when you said I was talking at the museum, it was connected to the fact that there was this project which freed up the resources to actually just lift the lid on some of those collections. Indeed, and see what they were. And then off the back of that, in some ways, there came then the decision to invest in the museum's first ever senior curator in photography, which, as we know, happened in 2016, I think. Yeah. I've argued a little bit, as I do, about the fact that is putting a senior curator of photography in an art department the wise thing to do, because art photography probably takes up 1%, 2% of the spectrum of photography. The commercial, the industrial, So straight away, I mean, there's it's difficult. It's not that anybody, people have made a mistake. It's not that at all. But you can only ever focus on one thing, I think, and do it really well. And then if you can get that to run really well, then perhaps you might sort of expand out. So Martin Parr is doing a fantastic job. He's already, he's still got work that he's doing to develop that whole project further. But it's very clear that it's British documentary photography. There it is, And even if you put that as part of, it's growing more important actually, interestingly, in contemporary photography. Documentary it's come back round again, But even then, in the broader contemporary photography, documentary is still only a part of, So in Wales, what okay, what's the equivalent? Well, if I were Martin Parr, right? Okay, I've got his money now, right? Yeah. Perhaps I would think about, okay, let's have a foundation around documentary photography in South Wales. Right, because that's where I grew up. That's the bit I really know. I love Wales. I love all of Wales, but I'd have to kind of call it to make the project, realisable. That word. Yeah. So whether again, back to photo gallery, which is an interesting one. Photo gallery's remit always has been a focus on contemporary photography. So in some ways, are they the right people to be doing that? Yeah. Which perhaps not. Now, as you probably know, back in 2000 and whatever. Oh no, actually before that it was 1990 something. Photo gallery did got quite a bit of funding actually from the Arts Council to develop a national centre for photography, and there was feasibility studies where that would be. And Margan Park came up, the castle, all the provenance of the Talbots and everything else, which was tremendous. But actually, part of the problem of the proposal, if you like, was that photo gallery couldn't deliver the ambition of contemporary photography, historical photography, so there was always going to be the partnership thing. So I think it's quite difficult to imagine something that sort of really embraces it all, which is why I'm suggesting a kind of a looser network, if you like,
Yeah, cool. So is this, I'd like to, since we've been talking about the museum, you're doing research at the museum. What are you delving into?
David Hurn at the moment. I think because David's been so generous and actually, really fascinating the work that he's now given the nation through his archive, his own archive, 1,500 pictures throughout his career, and his collection, which we've seen just recently, the Swaps show, which is a fantastic, absolutely tremendous show. It is only right that, having been working as a sort of Honorary Research Fellow at the museum for the last not quite a year yet, then the focus is very much on David, because the coming programs are all really relating to David. So at the moment, I've been working with him. He's very, very generous. He's been giving me his time and insights into his career, and I'm developing with him a project which is very much about his influence on photography and Wales. So back to photography and Wales. You can only do so much, but and he's an internationally acclaimed a photographer with a career. Before Wales ever sort of existed, in a way you feel as if David would have photographed it. But so we're looking at his early life in Cardiff. He grew up in Cardiff. The interesting teenage years that he had with his father being a very successful, having a successful military career. So David moved around outside of Wales for quite a few years. Then Sandhurst, and then his story going into photography, which he's told many times, is really interesting. How he realised all of a sudden, just looking at a magazine with Cartier-Bresson on, photographing it, well, my God, I need to be a photographer. Off he went, and he did that. So we've been looking at that early life, but also, the Aberfan, which really was where he connects.
It's a seminal moment for him. Really.
Emotionally, yeah. Yes. Back in Wales, I think he recognises the importance of Wales then, I think, more to him, to his own being. And then, of course, his return. But what we're doing is not just looking at his photographs, and basically I'm developing a book project with him and an exhibition, which may or these are things which are sort of at the what these things are like. I mean, they may or may not emerge, but the thrust, if you like, of the book really is it's about his approach to photography, because he, as you will know, he's reticent to talk about photographs in the sense that I stood there and I did that and I did that and I did that. He doesn't like doing it because he really believes, and rightly, that the photograph should speak for itself. And he's right. However, from a kind of history point of view, actually, it is nice to know, what's going through your mind, and it's kind of, it's really been interesting for me, because by the time I'd got to study at Newport, he'd left by a few years, and I assumed that a lot of what I was being taught about how to approach like a photo essay, which I call the classic approach, the different types of shots that you go for, people working, relationship pictures, whatever. Actually, talking to him, it's clear that it's not that easy, it's not that clearly defined in his mind. And I think there were others who worked with him who kind of tried to clarify it, perhaps to help it to be taught more clearly, if you like. But actually, David's a lot, I wouldn't say loose, it sounds like the wrong word, but he is incredibly intuitive, but he does have a very, very clear structure, and I've realised that his research he does before he goes anywhere near anything is astonishing. Indeed. So but that's an interesting story. So that's what I want to try and pull out.
Yeah, it comes back to backgrounds again, because military background with David Hurn, you with an engineer. Chalky Davis, engineering background. It's the meticulous nature of that background which has led to creating photo, and I can understand where David comes from completely because of it. And we've had experience of his research. We went with him to North Wales, but it's astonishing. He has folders. and he does his homework. You know? Yeah.
That's right. The other thing which though I think I've hinted at in fact in what I've written already, but David also, apart from being the photographer, he enabled things in Wales which has shaped all of us, as those of us who are interested in photography. Yeah. Newport itself, the story. I mean, I've kind of written bits of that, yes. But I've had far more interesting insights to that now, and so that I think is again a story worth retelling, but in more detail. The photo gallery story, how that started, which again, I've alluded to it several times, but the dynamic is very different to what I really thought, in that the importance of individuals in the Arts Council. Actually, throughout the 60s actually and 70s, it's something which needs to be developed and looked at further. Yeah,
because you refer to how they regarded photography as nothing really in the early days, and until things changed.
There were some inspired characters who thought otherwise. So David's role in that, and the fact that at Cardiff University, here Tom Hopkinson, who was the director of the School of Journalism then, had been the editor of Picture Post, and the relationship there is fascinating, one to be told, and again, we're having insights on that. But also the fact that, David doesn't stop. I mean, here we are now. He spent a long time, and I know because I've been talking to him about it for a long, long, long time, decade or more, about the museum, and they put in work there and so on. And he's been amazing at not only being generous, but he's savvy.
Yes, indeed.
And he's made sure that it's right, not just for him. It's nice that a big national organisation has your collection and stuff. That's lovely, of course it is. But he's making sure that it's right for the future.
Yes.
And that's a story which needs to be told, which will be told. So that's what we are working through.
Right. So from a collecting point of view, is the museum collecting contemporary photography now? Is it or because yes, we have David Hurn, but we have to think. Are they bringing in new material and new photographers? People like Roger Jones, for example, works out in Italy. His work is astonishing.
Yeah.
Are they thinking in those terms?
Well, I mean, Rodri and many contemporary photographers are in the collections because of the swaps.
Yes.
And
but I'm thinking in terms of bigger collections from these artists.
Well, again, you just pressed a little alarm bell there. Because all of a sudden now we start to talk about, you talk about artists and I talk about photographers.
Well, yes, I mean...
Right? So
okay.
So let me just, that's unfair, but let me just characterise it a little bit.
Yeah.
So imagine that, as a senior curator, my friend Bronwyn Culhern at the museum, she has a responsibility for photography.
Yes.
Collecting photography. And so she is, shall we say, restricted in simply in terms of funds.
Finance.
That's part of it. We live in austere times everywhere. That's part of it. But also, how do you build on what David has done as well? It's about making sure we get that right. Absolutely. Now, there's a get out of jail clause here, right? Which is, well, of course, that sits in, the photographer at the moment sits in the art department. There's nothing wrong with the art department acquiring contemporary art.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it might seem like semantics and it might seem like a bit of a dance, but it is that.
Yeah.
One of the things which I'm working on with the museum at the moment is to really to further develop and clarify a policy around collecting, because it is thank God that museums do it, but the responsibility of then keeping the conditions and so on, it's a very, very expensive thing to do, you know. And I think certainly when I was younger, I would offer it work to everybody. You know, you could have it for nothing, and everybody go, well, no, that's going to actually cost us thousands to keep, you know. So there is a bit of that. But actually, again, just to go back to my friend David Hurn, who I admire enormously. What is he, right? And if you ask him, he's a photographer. Of
course he is. Yes.
You know, and I'm with him completely on that one. That's great. And he has this lovely sort of story, as he always does, about artists. And he said, well, he actually was saying to me, he said, well, you know, I can understand like a painter paints or a sculptor sculpts or whatever, but what does an artist do? You know, and he said, I asked the question of a gallerist, and the gallerist said, David, if I put your photographs on my wall, you're an artist. And he went, okay, that's fine. So it's so in a way, it's a nice way of saying it. It is about what other people who have influence consider that thing to be. I have to say that I am less interested in art.
Okay.
Per se, I am very interested in photography, but I realise that photography can be art, often is art, and often is, you know, used in incredibly amazing ways, you know, by artists. And again, a friend of mine, Helen Sear, absolutely tremendous artist using photography, and you know, but if I called her a photographer, she'd slap me, you know. So, so that was my warning button. Sorry, I was just
no, that's absolutely fine. In terms of education, I mean, you've been in the world of education at a very senior level. And how do you see the education of photography in Wales? What does it? And how do you think? I mean, you have the Newport days, and everybody eulogises Newport, and rightly so. Some wonderful photographers have come from there. But how do you see the photography in Wales today?
Yeah, it's very different. And again, I'm quoting David all the time. But it's true to say that the Newport that he developed and worked with, you know, in the 70s and 80s was completely different to what we have now. And in fact, there was no degrees, you know. You didn't have to do a degree, but you had to learn how to be a photographer, for example, you know. And there were grants which would allow you to do that. And actually, again, his focus would have been to have had people who might have been disadvantaged through redundancies or whatever, you know. They're the people, you know, and as we've been discussing, I mean, lots of people come from one career into photography. I think it's really good that you do that, because you have a kind of life skill, if you like, before you then get near a camera. So that was then. I mean, by the time that I'd started to teach photography, I started off in Bridgend College, actually. That was my sort of first serious job, really. And I loved that, because I had 15, 16 students, and I was teaching them the basics of photography. You know, this is, you know, lens thing and so on. But more than that, it was about how to think about the world around you. And I suppose the one thing that and I think still does continue very much in the documentary course at the University of South Wales is doing things with integrity and respect for the subject and so on. So I've always been interested in that. As I became more of a manager, you kind of, it's not quite turning to the dark side, but you see the pressure the other way, and it is important that to still deliver courses in the best possible way. You have to be up to date. You have to know what's trending in photography. What skills do people need? And certainly more and more over the last 5 or 6 years, what I've been doing is really making sure that I'm tracking the industry. So we're back to industry and looking at, but what does industry really need? You know, and it's that's often quite different to what has been traditionally taught, because I think the trouble with people who teach, and I know I've done it, is that you imagine that the world is just like it was when you went through college yourself. You kind of you mould the world, your world of teaching around that experience that you had of being taught. That's oversimplification, and not every, I don't say everybody does that, but it is different, it is difficult. And the problem now for universities is that it's and those who work in universities, it's a business, so you have to be able to do that financially, be viable and so on, and doing that. And quite often that means that you need to recruit lots of students. Now, I was very fortunate. I had a couple of years as the director of the Institute of Photography at Falmouth University, which is one of Britain's best photography universities. The resources to die for. Every year we would bring in over 3 undergraduate courses. There would be nearly 300 students every year coming in. But we had a budget where we'd be spending, hundreds of thousands of pounds a year on equipment, So it was, it was pro rata. You kind of, the resource came because you had the students. And you would be very much connecting them in to industry. So, and again, all universities do this, but you have people from industry coming in, you're making sure that you're giving placements and so on. And one of the things that I rebooted down there, actually, hopefully into a stronger thing, and it's still in development, is as a creative agency. So that it's not just you learn, you're doing this as a kind of, don't worry if it goes wrong, no, you're doing it.
Yes.
That's part of your learning,
Of course.
So I think but the pressures are difficult, and I do feel for those who are really interested in photography and want to study it, because it's expensive. Of course it is. I would say that there will always be those of 100 people who want to study photography. There'll be about 4, 5 perhaps who will really be great photographers. Whether or not they need a degree to do that, I'm not so sure. You can learn a lot of the things that you need just by doing.
Indeed.
But you've got it is an intellectual activity as well, of course. But that said, one of the things which has been said many times, so I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said before, but I think in a certain period in academic history, if you like, when people weren't quite sure what they should study, they default to English or geography or whatever, because it would give them an insight into the world, an academic experience to learn in the ways that you need to learn at a degree level, to think in the way that you need to at that level. And it's shifted away from those sorts of subjects like English and geography and those sorts of things, classics or whatever, into creative stuff. So photography is part of it. It's not the only thing, but it's part of it. So actually, the world is now completely full of visual imagery. We look at thousands and thousands of photographs every day in one way or another. So even if you're not going to be a photographer, but if you just want to be able to navigate through life, to have that...
To understand.
To understand that, I think is really important. But again, things go around and come around and go around, and I think that what we're likely to see more of, I think, will be the bespoke masterclass, 1 week, 2 weeks of, I spent quite a few years actually working on in the Glamorgan summer school.
Right.
I was teaching colour printing, and I loved it. For 2 weeks, you'd have people from all over the world. They'd descend, and it'll take me about 2 days to be able to get my eye back into colour printing and so on. And the nights out made even more difficult. The socialising was great. But what was fantastic was that actually, to find out that actually Joseph Kudelka used to teach on that back when he first came to stay, again with our friend David Hurn. He was teaching when it was based down in Barry. So I think those sort of opportunities that people, if you want to really learn, go and do it with somebody who really knows what they're doing, and there is more of that. There's a lot of that developing, and I've certainly been involved in exploring those opportunities, in a university kind of environment. But it's not just for a 3-year course. That's quite different. That's quite sharp.
Talking about masters of photography, we have your book here, Creative Photography and Wales, and the cover shot is of the three miners. And you stated, I read one of your articles on your website. You said one of the things you said, I hate the photograph of the three miners, but you changed your mind. He didn't spend a lot of time here in Wales. I think it was a general election, was it? That was the reason he came over.
Yeah, that's right. So he was desperate to get to Spain, and as we probably all know, all the photographers should know, that probably the greatest photo essay he ever did was in Spain.
Yes.
And he was desperate to get there to do it. And Life magazine, who he was always arguing with, allowed him to go to Spain as long as he stopped off in Britain on the way to cover the general election, the Attlee one. And Life magazine and Henry Luce was a particularly right-wing publication, and were very much supporting the Conservatives during that election. So part of Smith's brief was to go to Wales and show how backward Britain was in its old industrial practices. So he spent some time down the Vale, Vale of Glamorgan, where he hired a herd of cows to block a cement lorry. As an interesting thing about Eugene Smith and truth, which is perhaps another conversation, yes. but the actuality of truth, he wasn't one to lie so much, but he could colour it a little bit. Yes. And of course, photographing in Wales, he was looking to show really that the mining industry was still dated back, 20, 30 years ago. The reality was that he always had been throughout his life very sympathetic to the working classes. Yeah. His own family had suffered in the Depression, and so on. So, like the great photographers do, he kind of, he was treading the fine line of satisfying the client, Life magazine, and actually making pictures which equally said something more than just, that's a really backward place, isn't it? And so the picture of the three miners is one where I think it's become one of the sort of classic photographs of the 20th century. Indeed. It is up there, in the canon, and the fact that there are three miners, so one represents the past, one represents the present, and one's looking to the future, and oh God, and it's tremendous because actually I didn't realise it, but when I was on my way to see my uncle in Barry, so you could show me how to do photography, we used to drive through the street in the background.
Right. Okay. You know. He didn't really venture that far into the valley to take that photograph, did he? I mean, we're at Honorary Way.
No. To be fair, now, come on, give him a bit of fair play here. He did move around, and he I don't think he stayed anywhere too long, but he certainly photographed in Tonopandi. He was up in Merthyr, and so on and so forth. If I could just say, one of the things about the picture, which, for anybody who's interested in history, history is a loaded thing, and you've got to be careful when you start to write it or think about it and so on. And therefore, the research and so on has to be as meticulous as it can be, and sometimes even then you get it wrong and everything else. That picture is really fascinating because having looked at the picture for quite a few years and having read what other people had said about it and what Eugene Smith himself had written about it. He wrote a letter to his wife and said, I was in this place, and these guys were coming out of the mines, and the light was just right. And I called to them, and they turned, and I just took the picture. No, I called to them. My assistant called them. And they turned, and I took the picture, and off they went. And it was a fantastic picture, crackles with power and everything else, which it does. So of course, we with Di Smith and David Olusoga, when we were doing the program around the lost pictures of Eugene Smith. Through one of my night classes, we found where the picture had been taken. So we collectively decided when we went there to do some filming, we said, well, let's go knock some doors then, And of course we found Vernon Watkins, the younger guy. And so a few days later, I went to see Vernon, and before he was interviewed, actually, a bit naughty really, for the camera, and I said, Eugene Smith said, that it was, there was a gang of you, and his assistant called out, and he said, he didn't have an assistant, and actually, if you look at the contact sheets, you'll see that he was very carefully constructing the shot. It takes a few shots before he gets the right picture. So it's not that thing. So history is dangerous, because sometimes, even though you read it in a book published by a great publisher, or you see it in a be careful.
I mean, I don't know how long did Eugene Smith stay in Wales?
It was a week.
A week.
I think.
What do you think he would have discovered and photographed if he'd have stayed a lot longer and done a photo essay about the values of Wales?
Well, I mean, part of the work that I did around that, I constructed a photo essay of the pictures that he made in Wales. Right. Life wouldn't have published it, of course not. Okay. And interestingly, I literally, and again, this is what historian type researchy people do, is I analysed Spanish Village, all those great country doctors. I analysed them. What were they? What was he putting together every time? And it's back to the Newport thing. It's the relationship picture, and it's the so on and so forth. And you could see that there was a photo essay very much being developed. So I had a stab at imagining what that might be, using the words, the typography and so on of the day. And I felt that Smith had probably, you're right, he hadn't been here long enough. It fell short of being a full-blown essay. And I think what he was concentrating on as much as anything, he was spending a lot of time in Tredegar, and a photograph in the Workman's Hall in Tredegar with a bust of Aneurin Bevan. Of course, it's just the start of NHS, and Labour's socially engaged policies and so on. So he was clearly photographing that. His own records, his own research. We were talking about photographers with their reams of stuff. He'd already done a pile of research on, the medical centres and so on that were around the valleys. He was also photographing transport, because up until 1950, most people in South Wales would have probably been walking to work, to the pit or whatever. Of course, places like Treforest Estate had opened up, so he's photographing the buses. The fact that people were now starting to commute. So actually, I think he was showing. I think he would have shown the positives.
Yes, indeed.
Life wouldn't have published it though. Anyway, but he didn't quite. I don't think he quite got there.
So where were the Welsh photographers during that time? Were they Welsh photographers? Who was working during that time, Paul?
Yeah, well. The great comparison I can see is Jeff Charles, actually.
Ah, yes, of course,
and of course Jeff Charles, based in North Wales, and actually working for EMYR. So Welsh language mainly, and mainly agricultural kind of stuff, but amazing. Again, National Library have his fantastic collection there, and he came into South Wales in the early 50s, 52, 53, because they wanted to expand their readership. So they did an English language version. So he came in and he was photographing around the valleys. Very different, very, very different. Photographed actually, which always cheers me up, photographed the Welsh school in Pontygwaith, which my friend Alan Rhys Hughes, photographer,
yes, of course,
which is because we both grew up in Inseer.
Right.
And he went to the Welsh school and I didn't. So you can see that, Jeff Charles, quite rightly, again, that's what photographers do. They focus on the things that they're interested in, they know. So it's less about the hardship of industry. And in fact, he actually photographs the development of the steelworks in Port Talbot.
Yeah.
So again, it's quite positive. It's these things are growing and developing. Yeah. But yeah, there are. It appears sometimes that there are gaps.
Yes.
Because I think anybody who's ever been any good as a photographer in Wales has usually gone off and done something interesting, like a Vietnam War or something,
Yeah. It was really funny because my connection when I was in college, and I went to teacher training college up in North Wales, but I was spending more time in a dark room than I was actually doing what I was meant to do. But I did actually write to a Cymro to ask for a job. But it never happened. They wrote back a very kind letter, and I sent them pictures, and they wrote me a very kind letter back saying that they thought my pictures were excellent, but that it was not a job that was, that it wasn't being a photographer wasn't a proper job, and that I should stick to being a teacher, which I never did, but there we are, that's another story. But Jeff Charles, I mean, you talk, in one of your essays, you talk about the social change happening in Wales during the late 60s, the upsurge of Welsh language, protests, etc., which Jeff covered. I mean, he did the first Welsh language protest, I think, on the bridge in Aberystwyth. So there was a lot of interesting stuff happening during that period, which he covered, which is fascinating.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, and I would say that the one person that I haven't mentioned, which I should really, of course, is Marion Delyth.
Oh, of course, yes.
Because her work, I think, is hugely important, and it is absolutely about the energy around language and around the changes to Wales. And I think where Marion is in some ways particularly interesting is that she was rooted initially in South Wales, and she did some work here, but her work with the protests and so on, but her work around the Mynydd Bach work is astonishing, because it really literally shows you the process of the incomers coming in and sort of changing, literally changing the way that areas operate, because they become sort of second homeowners. Yeah,
well, that's another fascinating thing, because it sounds like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but I'm not really, is that a book I'm working on is about Pembrokeshire, and I have a lot of my mother's photographs that she took. And there are pictures of people in houses and pictures of people outside houses, which now basically are holiday homes, and some have even changed their names of the cottages. And so that sort of social change is, and it's important to document it, even if it's a banal picture of just something saying holiday home on it, From your own perspective and the work, I presume you still take photographs. I'm very interested in your poles photo. So what drove you to take pictures of poles?
Well, I once said that the history of photography is littered with poles, because people like Robert Frank and so on. But actually, it's what they symbolised, of course, was important, and back, certainly in the sort of late 19th century and so on, they would appear in lots of photographs as a kind of sign of modernity, and the idea that, usually driven by commerce, of course, all these things, everything happens because it's commercially sensible to do it. So there was a bit of that, and funnily enough, I was spend a bit of time in West Wales. I think I was driving down to Caerbourg or somewhere one day, and I was just watching how beautiful these lines were with these poles, and it just made me think about the visual aspect of them, but also we'd just been going through this the Arab Spring, and the fact that for the first time social media was enabling people to gather themselves to be able to kind of challenge, you know, whatever the dominant sort of ideas were or dominant features in society. And of course, as I look out of my landing window and I look out and I see, well, actually, look, there's this wire that comes into my house from that pole over there. And my world is on that line, you know, my internet, my everything, you know. And so I often wonder, you know, what happens if you just went out one day with a chainsaw and chopped a few down? It could cause havoc. Yeah. So there's that. So it's about, you know, I think the sort of fancy words is that they became, or they have become more increasingly kind of weird because they're archaic in the sense that they're just like wooden poles, but actually they hold up civilization and our infrastructure. And I think it's particularly interesting then, and the sort of theme which goes through a lot of goes through all of my work really, is about where things are, where they are placed. And so it's when you think about the importance of communications for Wales, in South Wales in perhaps particular, with you know the old industries and so on, that way that they connected and was able to trade and so on. It all comes through that. But now we live in a time where there's sort of so many channels for communications. I think it's, you know, for all that we quite rightly concerned about Facebook being harvested for data and changing, you know, political outcomes, which of course is a travesty. But that's the world we're in, and actually the poles are part of that infrastructure. And back to my engineering, you know, it's back to those things. I'm really interested in how things, why are things there? Because everything has to be there for a reason. And, you know, how are they put there and so on. And, you know, one of the things that I love about what I do is, I suppose, is that whenever you photograph anything that is ubiquitous, that you see absolutely everywhere, the minute you start photographing lots of them, you realise actually they're all quite distinctly different. They are different.
Yeah, they are different.
And quite often they're designed in a different way, you know, whatever, you know. So so it is that, but it's more, as much as the thing itself, it's about the place and the history of the place, and you know.
Independent galleries, how important, or do you think they have a role? We have had the third floor gallery in which hopefully is going to restart, a reboot. But how important do you think they are to Wales, and do you think we should have more of them?
Yeah, yes, they're very important, and you know the work that the third floor has done is already, you know, has proved to be brilliant. What's a problem for them and for anybody else with an independent gallery is how do you sustain it? And again, I know certainly from my time when I was at Newport as a manager, we did support third floor gallery to an extent, but you know we couldn't do that forever, you know. And they moved on to the next thing, and they managed, you know, and they kept going. So that's the difficulty. But I think it's really important, and I think that, you know, we're witnessing this real growth, and sort of sincere growth in the interest in photography. Everybody's a photographer anyway, so you know, people are really interested in well, what does it mean to be a photographer? How do I represent somebody in the right way, in the wrong way, or myself, which is on the selfie? You know, do I do that in the right or the wrong way? So it's a really fascinating time. And again, I think that you know, the work at Kickplate, you know, for example, Abertillery, amazing. You know, I mean, they focused on documentary. You see, they've kind of got quite a particular focus.
A niche,
You know, and I think that's the way to go. I mean, become really good at whatever it is, and. The Kickplate project, which is a slightly different thing down in Pontypool, you know, that's more of a fine art contemporary art thing.
Yes.
And that's interesting, and that's
Indeed.
great, and they should keep doing it. So I think, the more that those things are done, it's good. But whoever does it, and luckily enough, those who are involved in doing things at the moment, they really do it very, very well.
Yeah. Do you think there's a place for, we at Ffoton have brought out a couple of zines, where we've instigated people to contribute to Instagram feeds, etc., and then produced do you think there's a place for that sort of thing?
Yeah.
And that should be developed in some sort of way?
Yeah, well, again, I wonder, like lots of things in this world that we're now in, with the changes in technologies and interest, we're becoming far more interested in material things again, aren't
Indeed,
we?
yes, like the vinyl and all that sort of stuff.
So that's a positive, perhaps, in terms of the digital technologies. So I think we should roll with it, but I think it'll change as well. But I think it's good. But I think, again, to imagine that the zines is a thing which will last forever. No, it won't. But actually, at the moment, it's really good. Yeah. It's hot. It's something which people really appreciate. And again, what I like about that is it's making people think not just about images, but it's making them think about how images are put together and what happens when you put two images together. How does it change the image?
The dynamic can change completely.
Absolutely, So those things I think are really important. So yes, but I think it's a mixed economy. You need to have you need to have the big galleries, the national things. You need to have the small independents. Importantly, you want people to engage.
Yeah. You talked earlier about creating this sort of hub where people can. Is that your dream thing, or do you have? How do you see photography developing? How would you like it to see it develop in Wales? And sort of.
We are looking. Bronwyn at the museum and I have, and others in other organisations, one or two, have started to have a conversation about that network idea. How would that work? What would it look like? How much would it cost? Who would run it? What would you need to run it, and so on? And there are some examples. Not that you should follow examples either, but it's worth looking at what's been going on, and certainly in Scotland, in the museum and gallery sector, there's been the Institute of, is it the Scottish Institute of Photography or the Institute of Scottish Photography? I can't quite remember which way it's called, but basically it's a fairly loose but very effective collaboration between the national galleries and I think street level gallery.
Yeah. But do you by their very nature, institutions like museums, while we need them and it's good to have them, the process the grinding is very slow. Do you think that could negate any possibility of a hub being created?
Well, I don't think it negates it, but I think it could only ever be part of something which is it has to, whatever's created has to be dynamic.
Yes.
And you're right. The bigger institutions, by their very nature, have a kind of inertia thing. Yes. Which is not their fault. I mean, that's the nature of the thing. So a network would need to be dynamic. It would need to be changing, evolving, and this is why I raise the point about who's it. I mean, always the important thing is who's it for.
Indeed.
Who's at the other end of it? Who's going to engage with it? Because it shouldn't be for the people who are organising it, or the institutions that they represent. It should be about the people who want to engage with it.
So the conversation should be a Welsh-wide conversation then, as far as people who are interested in photography.
Absolutely. Equally, and this is the challenge always is you have to have informed conversation as well. So there has to be, a sense brought to how that might work. But the minute I think you start to sort of lay down, like these are the rules and whatever, forget it. because we don't want that.
No.
We've had enough of it. And I think that I think actually genuinely the world is changing away and moving away from that anyway. I think the idea that I've seen it in higher education in particular, I say in the last few years, the idea of agility, being agile. University be agile. You think, what? On one hand, you think that's a kind of weird concept, but they tell you they get it, they're starting to understand it.
Okay.
And so, some of the initiatives that I was part of developing or took the lead on developing in more recent times, they were kind of quite quick responses to opportunity. Sounds like it's the wrong word, but things emerge which that would be really interesting to do. There'd be people interested to do it. It's good for us, it's good for everybody. Let's do it. Come on then. And you've got to find a way to do it. So it's about being agile. The minute you've got a planning committee or anything else, you still have to have a little bit of that, but
yes.
So be agile, think about who's it for, and let's do it. But this is the problem is, where do you start? And you need to get some informed ideas.
Yes.
What we've done, actually, we had to we've kind of pressed pause on that a while ago, actually, because of the developments, with the gallery and with working with David. Again, we're only our resource is us. So.
Yes, indeed.
So, but I'm sure that there's. At some point, there should be a gathering, really, get people together and think about that, You never know. Perhaps that's something that, through the museum, perhaps it does take somebody like the museum to do that, to say, well, look, let's have a national
debate
conversation about
conversation, yeah.